This is take two. We're going to try again, and this time I have my assistant here to help me as we go along. One thing that I've realized is something that you guys probably realized day one of this class is that I talk too much. So I am going to try and stay focused and be short, and at least, if nothing else, the videos will be under 15 minutes. So here we go. The first two things are the candidate access rule and the equal opportunity rule, which are basically hangovers from the fairness doctrine, which I said, in the last video, that went away in the 80s. A couple things did. They were added, actually, to FCC oversight in the 70s as part of one of the Communication Act rewrites. Section 312 and Section 315, which are mentioned a couple times in the chapter. You should be aware of those. Yeah. And again, if you think back, we were talking about public interest. To be able to serve the public interest, one of the things that broadcasters have to do is to provide political information, and that can count or advertising, political advertising can count as that information. What the candidate access rule says is that broadcasters need to give reasonable access or sell reasonable amounts of time to qualified federal candidates. The federal is important. That means Senate, Congress, the President. Lower offices, you do not have to, our broadcasters do not have to offer equal time. Reasonable access, which just means access means the ability to buy advertising on those networks. One of the cases that decided what reasonable means was CBS versus FCC in 1981, decided in 1981. It actually begins in 1979 when Jimmy Carter's campaign asks CBS for a half an hour of prime time to begin their campaign. CBS says no. It goes to the FCC, and the courts in the FCC agree that CBS is wrong in this case. CBS's rationale for not allowing or giving the Carter campaign time was that it was too early. This is in December of '79, about 10 months before the election, and they're saying too early. Imagine. So CBS loses, and what the case establishes is that networks cannot, or broadcast licensees cannot make blanket policies. They have to decide these cases individually. When someone comes to ask for time, for advertising time, they need to decide that request case by case. The other thing, reasonableness, if that's a word, factors include the time that's been used, the time, how much more time the campaigns may need, and how much this might disrupt their schedule. Disrupting the schedule is something that the FCC realizes that should be something that the networks or the broadcast licensees should be determining, because again, that's how they make their money, is through advertising. So moving on to the equal opportunity rule, this is section 315 of the Communication Act. This is not so much about time or about advertising. This is about the ability of all candidates to reach the same audience. That has to do with, like, if you want to reach a primetime audience or you want to reach that morning audience, they're different audiences. And so you basically have to give candidates the equal opportunity to reach those audiences in a similar way. And so one of the terms that you're going to hear a lot in this section, or read a lot in this section, is use, because use is what triggers this rule. So you should be asking yourself, what is a use? What is considered a use? Use is not a newscast. If you're doing your news program and a candidate comes to town and you do a story on them, that's not considered a use. That's your editorial decision. If the other candidates for that same office, they can't come to you and say, we want that same time. That doesn't work. That's not a use. Interview shows like Meet the Press or Face the Nation are also not considered a use. They're not considered, you don't have to make time available for all the candidates every week, sort of thing. Spot news, like I said, political conventions, presidential press conference, anything that candidates do that you cover as news is not considered a use. The next question becomes, what is a use then? And a use is any amount of time on your network where a candidate's voice or image appears. If you put that candidate in a entertainment program, if you do some sort of special broadcast to cover that candidate, that's considered a use, and you have to then make available the same amount of time for other candidates for that same office to use. Okay, so we have the equal opportunity rule that deals with making sure that candidates have the opportunity to reach the same audience or similar audiences. The equal access rule, again, has to do with allowing all candidates for office to buy time on your network. And all this has to do with, again, that public interest angle of treating people fairly, treating candidates fairly, and giving your audience information that they need to make good decisions about who to vote for. One last thing we should cover with the equal access rule and the equal opportunity rule is the Zapple rule, which, similar to the equal access, this basically, equal access says if you offer time to candidate A, you also have to offer it to candidate B. The Zapple rule says if you offer time to supporters of candidate A, you also have to offer it to supporters of candidate B. All right, so that's covers those two pieces, I guess, the leftover pieces of the fairness doctrine that still are enforced against broadcasters. Jumping just real quickly to children's programming, if you recall way back to the beginning of the semester, one of the things we talked about is that substantial government interest. If they're going to regulate speech, if they're going to regulate broadcasters, they have to have or show some sort of substantial government interest. In this case, it is education and socialization of children. They feel that that's important enough that they can make some sort of restrictions on the broadcast license holders' freedom of expression. It has to be content neutral, as we talked about. They can't basically make these decisions based on content, but they can say, and they have, and this is the rule, I think right now for educational program is 3 hours a week. And so they don't say what kind of broadcasting, what kind of educational broadcast, they just say has to be available 3 hours a week at a time when kids are obviously going to be watching. When I used to watch with my kids, it was kind of interesting how children's like Saturday morning cartoons had changed. I was growing up, I got Scooby-Doo, I got Johnny Quest, Tom and Jerry, lots of violence and stuff like that. As my kids were growing up, they watched Recess, Doug, Hey Arnold, much more educational, much more directed at socialization, teamwork, that kind of thing. So I thought, that was an interesting change for me to see in kids. But again, that kind of public interest that the broadcasters can serve is through children's programming, educational programming. That's one of the ways that broadcast licensees can show we're meeting the public interest. All right. There are additional limits on the amount of advertising that can go into children's programming. There's fewer minutes in an hour that can be used for advertising on kids' programming. The last thing to talk about is just cable TV, satellite, and internet. And I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Cable TV has some rules that it has to abide by. It has, again, like in Sioux City, it has to cover the entire city. It can't just say, it costs too much to cover Morningside. They have to deal with the whole city. There are also some differences in or requirements for the channels that they have to carry. They have to carry what are called PEG channels, public interest, education, and government channels. If you have cable, there's a government channel where you can watch city council meetings. That's pretty important right now as people are isolating themselves. They still want to know what's going on with city council. I think even the city council is meeting by conference and chatting online. And so, again, those have to be made available online or on cable, PEG channels, public access, education, and government channels. I think I'm going to stop there. I think I've already probably used my 15 minutes. I do want to bring up one last question that you can think about for our coffee chats. I mentioned that children's programming, that broadcasters, broadcast licensors have to offer a certain amount of educational broadcasting, educational television. Is that really necessary when you've got a number of cable channels specifically aimed at children and children's programming, when you've got streaming services that are dedicated to providing educational programming for children? Is it still necessary for the FCC to require that? Again, it's a matter of treating the broadcast licensees by differently than other. All right, so as I said, I think I'm pretty much done with my time. This ends the broadcasting chapter. I will be seeing you guys. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you for bearing with all that.